you've ever gone biking and you wished you had an extra place for your water bottle, this project is for you. Today we're making an over-the-handlebar water bottle holder, a fun fall sewing project that's perfect for your outdoor adventures. It simply snaps right over your bike's handlebars, so it works even if your bike doesn't have one of those traditional built-in mounts. And it's strong enough to hold a full-sized reusable water bottle without coming unclasped. You can even use it on a stroller, scooter, or anything with a handle. And it makes a great gift for an adventurer in your life. Hi, I'm Victoria, and I help you sew practical, stylish accessories that are ready for real life and real adventures. Now let's jump into the supplies. Obviously, you'll need fabric. I recommend using coordinating or cotton blend fabrics, roughly the equivalent of about 2 fat quarters. I'm using 4 different coordinating fabrics for mine, one for the outer body, one for the lining and bottom, one for the flat top that goes over the handlebar, and a 4th for the bias binding. You can mix and match or simplify yours to match your style. This is a great scrap-friendly project. You'll also need medium weight fusible interfacing. I like to use Heat & Bond's medium weight fusible interfacing because it's easy to work with and adds structure and stability to the project without extra bulk or weight. You'll want enough for each fabric piece, which means about the same amount as needed for fabric. At 20 inches by 1 yard, one standard Heat & Bond package will be plenty for this project. 2 large sew-on snaps. I'm using extra large snaps about 3 times the size of regular ones instead of Velcro or regular snaps to ensure the clasp is strong. You'll also need 2 medium or large sew-on buttons to cover the stitching from the snaps on the outside of the top flap. Optional iron-on vinyl. I'll be using Heat & Bond's iron-on vinyl to laminate the outer fabric. This gives the finished holder a water-resistant, wipeable finish. Great for biking through mud or damp conditions. I like this one because it's easy to use and protects the fabric without adding bulk or compromising flexibility. Now you'll only need roughly about 1/4 yard, so one 17-inch by 2 yards package is more than enough. And lastly, of course, you'll need coordinating thread. Now, I've linked all of the supplies for you in the description below so you can quickly find what you need. Now, before we start, give all of your fabric a quick press to ensure your cuts are accurate. Next, we'll cut our pieces. You will need 1 outer piece for the main body, cut to 11.5 inches wide by 8.25 inches tall. 1 lining piece for the main body, cut to 11.5 inches wide by 10 inches tall. 2 Y-shaped pieces for the top section that folds over the handlebar, and 2 circles for the bottom. Now, you could technically use a simple rectangle for that top piece, but I found it doesn't support the weight very well. The bottle ends up pulling forward and putting a lot of strain on the back. That's why I designed this custom Y-shaped piece. It extends further around the circle, adds structure, and keeps the holder balanced and sturdy while it's hanging on the handlebar. You'll also need a fabric strip to go around the top border of the bottle holder. Now, technically, this would usually be a bias strip, meaning it's cut on the 45-degree angle of the fabric where it has a bit of stretch and flexibility. But in my case, I'm not cutting on the true bias because I want to use what I have left of the purple plaid fabric, and I don't have enough leftover fabric to cut it diagonally. Since this strip is just finishing off the top border and doesn't need to stretch, it's totally fine to cut it straight along the grain instead. To make this easier, I've put together a digital sewing pattern that includes all 5 pattern pieces, including that shaped top and circular base that you can just print and trace plus 3D style illustrated instructions. It takes all of the guesswork out of measuring or drafting shapes and helps your holder come together cleanly and securely. You can grab the pattern using the QR code on screen or using the link in the description below. Next, we're going to cut and apply our medium weight fusible interfacing. You'll need to cut interfacing for all of your fabric pieces, both lining and outer layers, except for the bias strip. This adds structure and stability to the holder, helping it keep its shape and making it sturdier for everyday use. Once all pieces are cut, apply it by placing the shiny side of the interfacing against the wrong side of your fabric. Then press it on in sections, holding your iron for about 8 to 10 seconds in each spot until the whole piece is fused. The instructions recommend using a light pressing cloth. I usually just use a thin washcloth because it's easy. Be sure to follow the directions on your package if you're using a different brand, since instructions can vary slightly. Don't worry if the edges aren't perfect, we'll trim it later. Next, decide if you'd like to laminate your water bottle holder for extra protection. If so, cut and apply the iron-on vinyl to your exterior pieces only, including the bias strip. We're skipping the lining and the fabric that will touch the handlebars because the vinyl would make those areas stick instead of slide, and we want the holder and bottle to move smoothly as you use them. When you cut the vinyl, don't worry about getting it perfect. We'll trim off any extra once it's fused in place. To apply the vinyl, peel it off the backing paper, but don't throw the paper away. You'll need it for pressing. Place the vinyl on the right side of your fabric, smooth it out, and make sure there aren't any bubbles or wrinkles. It's more clingy than sticky, so you can lift and reposition it until it's lined up. Once it's smooth, lay the backing paper shiny side down on top to protect the vinyl. Never let your iron touch the vinyl directly. Then follow the instructions on your package for pressing. With the brand I'm using, I press and hold for about 8 seconds per section, working across until everything is laminated. Before we move on, take a minute to trim any extra interfacing or vinyl that's hanging over the edges of your fabric pieces. This makes the pieces easier to work with and keeps everything even so your seams line up correctly later on. Next, we're going to press a 1/4 inch double fold along the top and bottom edges of both the lining and outer pieces of the main body. By that, I mean to fold the edge over a 1/4 inch, press it, and then fold it again another 1/4 inch toward the wrong side. If you laminated your outer fabric, remember to use your vinyl backing paper while you press it so the vinyl doesn't melt or stick to your iron. And just like I mentioned in my last video, with vinyl pieces, it helps to press down a 1/2 inch first using a heat-resistant ruler, then fold that in half towards itself to get your double fold. The vinyl is easy to work with, but this method makes it a little simpler since you can't press it quite like regular fabric. Now we're going to sew down those double folds we just pressed on the lining and outer pieces of the main body. Stitch along both the top and bottom edges to secure those folds in place. Doing this now makes it easier later on. Once we turn the pieces into a cylinder, the edges will already be neatly finished. And if you laminated your outer fabric, be sure to switch to a non-stick/Teflon presser foot so the fabric slides smoothly under the needle. If you don't have one, you can try a piece of tape on the bottom side of the presser foot. A regular metal foot can stick to the vinyl and make it harder to sew evenly. Next, we're going to sew the main body pieces into cylinders. Take each piece, place the right sides together, and line up the long, open edges. If you laminated your outer fabric, use wonder clips instead of pins so you don't poke holes in the vinyl. Those can't be undone later. When it comes to edges, I tend to prefer wonder clips anyway because they're faster. Now, once both the lining and outer pieces are clipped or pinned, take them to the machine and sew those open edges closed. I'm using an overedge stitch to ensure the seam is strong, but if your machine doesn't have that, a zigzag stitch works just as well. Just make sure the outer swing of your zigzag lands right on or just over the raw edge of the fabric to keep it neatly enclosed. Now we're going to attach the bottom circles to both the lining and the outer layer. Leave each cylinder as it is, then flip it upside down and place the right side of the circle against the right side of the cylinder. For the lining layer, pins work best here, but for the outer layer, if you laminated it, you'll want to use wonder clips so you don't poke holes in the vinyl. As you pin or clip, gently flatten and shape the circle around the edge of the cylinder. If the circle cups downward a bit, like a bowl, that actually helps it fit more easily. And by the way, if you notice my wristlet pin cushion, I think it's the coolest thing. Super handy and keeps me from chasing pins all over the place. I'll link a similar one in the description below if you'd like to check it out. Anyway, once both circles are attached, sew around one using an overedge stitch or a zigzag stitch. I really recommend using one of these because this seam will hold the full weight of your water bottle, so it needs to be strong and secure. As you sew, pivot slowly around the circle, flatten the fabric as you go, and stop occasionally with the needle down to adjust your positioning. If you're using an overcasting presser foot, the guide on the foot helps you keep the raw edge aligned for an even finish. Now take your time with this part. It's not hard, but it does take a bit of patience. When you're done, check the seam all the way around and reinforce any weak spots. Then turn the outer layer of the main body right side out so we can move on to the next step. Next, we're going to press the top edge of the lining layer down by 2 inches toward the wrong side of the fabric. Since we haven't turned the lining right side out yet, that means you'll fold it towards the outside, the part you can see right now, by about 2 inches. Give it a quick press to hold the fold in place and add a couple of clips just to reinforce it while we move on to the next step. Now we're going to nest the lining inside the outer layer. Slide the lining cylinder down into the outer cylinder, lining up the back seams and the bottoms, then smooth everything out so it sits evenly all the way around. Next, fold that 2-inch edge of the lining over the top of the outer layer and pin it in place. You can use pins here since they'll only go through the non-laminated fabric, which makes it easier to get under the machine. I would definitely recommend being generous with the pins here because it will likely shift a lot under the machine if you're stingy with them. Now we're going to sew around the top border of the lining to secure everything in place. Stitch all the way around the circle, following the same stitching line you made earlier, about 2 inches down from the top edge. You'll be sewing right over that previous seam. And I'll be honest, this is probably the trickiest part of the whole project. The opening is narrow, so it's a bit of a workaround to get it under the machine. Take your time and be patient here. You'll need to pivot the fabric frequently, maybe every couple of centimeters, by leaving the needle down, lifting the presser foot, and turning the piece a little at a time. As you sew, be careful not to catch the other side of the holder underneath and accidentally sew the opening shut. Keep gently pulling that extra layer away from the presser foot so it doesn't get stitched by accident. It won't be perfectly smooth, and that's totally okay. This step is more about function than perfection. Even if your stitching wobbles a bit, once the holder is finished, you'll never notice. It just blends right in. And once you've made it past this part, it's smooth sailing from here. Next, we're going to construct the handlebar flap, the piece that folds over the handlebars and snaps into place. Take your two Y-shaped pieces and place them wrong sides together. Clip or pin all the way around the edges, but leave an opening at the bottom of the Y shape that's about the size of your fist for turning it right side out later. I like to use wonder clips around the edges and then pins to mark the section I'm leaving unsewn. That way, I don't forget where to stop. Sew around the entire piece using an overedge stitch or zigzag stitch, leaving that opening unsewn for flipping. You could use a straight stitch here if you prefer, but I really recommend enclosing the raw edges. It gives you a stronger, cleaner finish and helps prevent fraying over time. Now we're going to flip the handlebar flap right side out. I like to use a point turner tool to help shape the corners, especially the tips of the Y shape. Those areas can be a little stubborn and the point turner helps them lie flat and look clean. Just be careful not to poke through the stitching. I'll often use the rounded edge of the tool for most of the edges and save the pointed end for those tighter angles of the Y-shaped sections. This part just takes a little bit of patience. It's not difficult, it just needs a bit of working and adjusting to get everything turned neatly. Next, we're going to press the handlebar flap so it's crisp, clean, and flat on both sides. Start by pressing out all the seams to ensure they lie flat, and go ahead and smooth away any wrinkles from turning it right side out. If you laminated your fabric, don't forget to use your vinyl backing paper on top of the vinyl side while you press, so you don't melt the surface. Then, take the unsewn edge at the bottom of the flap and fold it under just enough to tuck in those raw edges and make it line up evenly with the rest of the edge. You don't need to measure, just fold it until it looks clean and even. Give it a quick press, then clip it in place so it's ready to sew in a couple of steps. While the iron's still out, let's go ahead and prep the bias binding. Fold the strip in half lengthwise once and press it to make a crease. Open it back up, fold each long edge in toward that center crease, and press again. Then fold it in half once more along the same crease so all the raw edges are enclosed. Give it one last press and clip it to hold its shape. Next, we're going to sew the open edge of the handlebar flap closed. Simply top stitch right along that folded edge, keeping your stitching as close to the edge as possible so that it stays subtle and clean. If you laminated your top piece, don't forget to use the non-stick/Teflon presser foot. Now this next step is optional, but I find it really helpful. Normally, you'd stitch along the open side of the bias binding, but in this case, we're not doing that yet. We'll need that edge open later to wrap around the top of the holder. Instead, I chose to sew along the folded, closed edge of the strip. It's not required, but it helps stabilize the fold and makes the bias binding easier to handle when we attach it in the next step. Since this binding isn't cut on a true bias, it's not as flexible as standard bias tape. So Sewing along that top fold helps keep it in shape so it can just sandwich neatly over the edge later instead of flopping open or shifting around. And here's my human moment for this project. Out of habit, I reflexively sewed down both sides because that's what I usually do, and I had to rip out a full row of stitching to reopen it. And because of that, I made a bunch of extra holes in the vinyl. Hopefully, that will get covered up later. Next, we're going to turn the bias binding into a circle. Take your strip and bring the short ends together with right sides facing. You don't need to fold it completely in half, just line up those edges evenly so we can sew them together. Sew across that edge to close it into a loop. I plan to use a straight stitch here, but I actually switched to an over-edge stitch to make the seam more secure and prevent fraying. Once that seam is sewn, trim the very tip of the corners, like just a pinpoint, to help reduce bulk. Try not to clip the stitching, but if you graze a thread, it's no big deal. Then flip it back over and fold the binding back in half along its original folds. You should now have a circle of bias binding that's ready to attach later. Now we're going to attach the handlebar flap to the top of the main body. Start by folding the flap in half vertically, right down the center of the Y shape, and mark that center point. Line up that mark with the center back seam of your main body, keeping the right sides together. When you clip it in place, the flap will look upside down. That's exactly what we want. We'll flip it back later once it's sewn. Use wonder clips to hold it in place around the top edge. If you didn't laminate your fabric, you can use pins, but if there's vinyl anywhere on your project, definitely stick with clips so you don't poke holes. Sew along the connection point where the flap meets the top of the cylinder using an over-edge stitch or zigzag stitch. You can use a straight stitch if you'd like, but if you do, I'd go over it twice for strength. This seam carries the full weight of the water bottle. Now, compared to the earlier circular seams, this one's much easier. You'll still need to pivot occasionally by leaving the needle down and lifting the presser foot to turn the piece, but not nearly as often. It's right at the edge, so it's simpler to maneuver. Aw, I just ran out of bobbin thread, like right in the middle. That's like the worst timing. Well, if that happens to you, don't panic. Once you refill your bobbin, just start your new stitching line about 1 centimeter back over what's already sewn to lock those stitches in. That'll secure the seam just like a back stitch would have. Now you're just going to sew along the connection point between the flap and the back of the cylinder. You don't need to stitch all the way around the open front. Now we're going to attach the bias binding around the top edge of the holder. Fold the binding over the edge so it sandwiches the fabric between the layers and clip it all the way around. And as you know, if you laminated your project, definitely use wonder clips instead of pins. Once everything's clipped in place, sew a straight stitch all the way around the bottom edge of the binding to secure it. And of course, it's ideal to use a Teflon foot here. When pivoting the fabric under the machine, don't forget to put your presser foot back down. I somehow forgot to do this like 3 times while sewing this step. Silly me. Also, if you've noticed this little pokey tool I keep using while I sew, it's an awl, spelled A-W-L. It's great for guiding the fabric right up to the presser foot and keeping my fingers out of the way. Super handy for tight spots like this. And just so you know, the stitching here probably won't be perfect, and that's totally fine. Once everything's assembled, these little wobbles will disappear into the overall design. Next, we're going to flip the handlebar flap up and give it a good press. Pull the flap upwards so it's facing the top, and make sure the seam where it joins the main body is smooth and flat. You want that junction to sit cleanly without any bulk or half folds. It should lie right along the stitching line, not rolling underneath or puffing out. Once it's smooth, press that edge to a crisp seam. Now, if you're enjoying this project, don't forget to like the video and of course subscribe so you don't miss out on all the fun sewing projects and holiday content ahead. And don't forget, if you'd like to make this over-the-handlebar water bottle holder, or even just want to support the channel, you can download the pattern using the QR code on screen or using the link in the description below. And I'd love to know, where would you take yours on its first adventure? Are you more of a weekend biker, park stroller type, or are you planning a big fall ride? Tell me in the comments. Now back to the project. Now it's time to add the snaps that will hold the handlebar flap in place. Start with the top pair of snaps. Mark their positions about a ½ inch down from the top and a ½ inch in from each side of the flap, just as a guide. I find this easier than using the printed pattern here. It's simple and keeps everything symmetrical. When marking, I like to use a disappearing ink fabric marker. It's one of my favorite tools for things like this. The ink shows up clearly, but it fades on its own within a couple of days, so you don't have to wash out any lines later, which is especially helpful here since part of the lines are going to be underneath the snaps anyway. Now, before you start sewing, double check that you have the right sides of the snaps lined up so they actually snap together in the correct direction. It's such an easy mistake to make and not a fun one to fix. Sew the snaps on by hand using strong thread. I like to condition my thread with Thread Magic first. It helps prevent knots and tangles while you're sewing, and I don't know about you, but I tend to get a lot when I'm doing that. Also, just note these big snaps can be a little awkward to hold while you're sewing, at least they are for me. So here's what helps. Go around once, stitching through each snap hole once just to get it anchored, then go back around with several passes to really secure it. Repeat that same process for the other top snap. And just in case you're wondering why we're sewing them now rather than earlier, I wanted the snaps to go through both layers of the flap so they can handle the repeated pulling and the weight of a full water bottle. Functionally, it's much stronger this way. Once both top snaps are attached, fold the flap down as if it were wrapping over a handlebar and use the top snaps to mark the placement of the bottom snaps on the main body. I do this by lifting one side, tracing halfway around the snap with my disappearing marker, then unfolding and finishing the circle so I have a perfect guide for sewing. Sew the bottom snaps in the same way. One stitch through each hole to anchor, then go back over to reinforce. Make sure you do several stitches through each hole. These snaps will take the brunt of the weight every time the bottle holder is unsnapped. Now our last step is to hand sew the buttons onto the outside of the holder. You'll only need 2 buttons, and these go on the outer layer over the stitching for the bottom snaps, the part that faces outward when the holder is clasped. We're not adding buttons to the inside because once the holder is snapped over the handlebar, that area sits right behind the water bottle. Buttons there would just clink against the bottle, scratch the surface, and probably make a lot of noise while riding. Now these outer buttons are purely decorative, just to hide the stitching and add a little pop of color or personality. The size is up to you. Medium or large works best, depending on how much stitching you want to cover. Since these aren't functional, they don't need to be super strong. Just sew them securely enough to stay in place. I like to stitch sideways through the fabric layer above the snap rather than straight up and down, so I'm not trying to fight against the snap underneath. A few passes are plenty to hold it in place. And that's it, all done. Here's your finished over-the-handlebar water bottle holder, ready to take anywhere, whether you're biking, strolling, or just heading out for your next fall adventure. Now you'll never have to wonder if you've got enough room for that extra water bottle again. Now don't forget to grab your pattern if you haven't already. And if you're in the mood for another project, you might want to check out my organizer tote bag tutorial. It's a bit more involved, but totally worth it. You can find it right here.